Ladies and gentlemen, let me invite to the stage Professor Saskia Stachowitsch, who will be our keynote. If you can please come and join me, and I'll give you a nice warm welcome by introducing your expertise. Saskia traveled from Austria, and she's a scientific director at the Austrian Institute of International Affairs. But she's also senior research fellow at the Central European University. I'll just spend some time to really explore your profile because I think it's very interesting. She also previously held position as professor of international politics at the University of Vienna and was affiliated scholar at the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and postdoctoral fellow at the School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies at the University of Bristol. Very diverse profile, also a member of the Austrian Academy of Science, and she received Elise Richter and Erwin Schrödinger fellowships at the Austrian Science Fund. She also serves as co-editor of the Journal of International Relations and Development and at the scientific advisory boards of the European Forum Aufwach and the Science Commission of the Austrian Ministry of Defense. Saskia's Stachowitsch research profile is very rich to me, and it's very interesting because she's covering such a I would say, diverse content from critical studies and military studies and feminism and postcolonial studies, gender and security, but also military gender integration, EU border, Frontex, and privatization and security. And she's the author of Gender Ideologies and Military Labor Markets in the United States. I would let her add if she feels like she needs to add more to her profile. But to me, it's very important to cover the topic that she told us she will talk about today, which is the rethinking the global, I would say, insecurity from a gender perspective, looking at topics that are not always high politics, but also different areas. But without further ado, I invite her to talk, and I'm going to come back for Q&A. So if you have any questions, even online, this is the time to start asking your questions through Slido. Thank you.
Hello and good morning. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Alika, which was also very thorough and comprehensive. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you this morning. I'm happy to speak at a conference or a symposium that, from what I've seen and heard, really tries to strike a healthy balance between an alarmist single focus on the pandemic on the one hand and a more business-as-usual perspective that sees the pandemic as an unfortunate but ultimately singular event. I will use my opportunity to speak to you this morning to shine light on what a feminist perspective to foreign policy can contribute to thinking through and acting upon the consequences of the pandemic. But the pandemic has produced some of these consequences, for sure, but it has also transformed and exacerbated some of them, and some of them it has also simply revealed and shined a light on. I'm using the term feminist deliberately here, and not only gender and also not only women, because I think a feminist approach has more to offer to the analysis and mitigation of the consequences of the pandemic than simply promoting the inclusion of women into foreign policy institutions or the promotion of gender equality through foreign relations, though these are all very important and worthy causes, of course. So what do I mean by feminism in this context? Well, a narrow definition of feminism would have it that this is about bringing more women into foreign and security policy, that it is about considering the different effects of these policy areas on men and women, on gender relations at home and domestic and internationally. But I would argue for a broader definition, one that entails an intersectional approach to gender, that does not equate gender with women, and that takes into account the multiple structures of power in terms of race, sexuality, nationality, ability, and so forth. But also more widely, a definition that does not see feminism as an issue area, but really as a lens through which we might understand global challenges differently, that changes our perspective on what and who matters in foreign policy, moves our focus slightly away from approaches that center states and powerful institutions, moving us away from the logics and rhetoric of geopolitics and state interest, and instead include the everyday concerns and experiences of people and communities, especially women and other subjects that are traditionally sidelined in debates on international politics. And not only to include this everyday level, but to really understand it as connected to what is going on at the nation state and ultimately on the global level. Where, for example, the fate of a female sweatshop worker in the global south is understood as connected to the trade policies of powerful states, where we understand that the support of military families, for example, military wives in particular, is the foundation for how states wage war on a global scale. And this understanding entails a broader understanding of security that includes economic, ecological, and yes, global health concerns. Starting from the simple idea that security provision for some can cause insecurity for others. For example, enhancing border security regimes decreases the security of women refugees, or be reminded of the frequent reports we're hearing about international peacekeeping troops or other security forces that commit sexual violence against local women. The question is then, how do our institutions need to be set up to be able to see and address these concerns? And traditionally, foreign and security policy is not best placed to do this because it is a very male-dominated field, not only in terms of personnel, but also in terms of culture, values, and ideas. Luckily, today we have various policy instruments at our hands to address these concerns, most importantly, the UN Women, Peace and Security Agenda, WPS for short, a set of UN Security Council resolutions that centers the inclusion of gender perspectives into matters of security, armed conflict, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction. We also more recently see more states turning towards a feminist foreign policy, such as Sweden, Canada, and more recently, Mexico. So from this broad sketch of what feminism in international politics can mean, you may already see why such an approach is more relevant today than ever. The pandemic has highlighted, though in most cases not caused, a shift in what global politics, international relations, and foreign policy are all about. It has shown us that we can no longer compartmentalize the high politics of security and geopolitics, the relations between states, international organizations, and other big players in global politics. We cannot compartmentalize them from issues such as global health, but also the environment, climate change, and large-scale migratory movements. And it has shown us that the answer to these shifts cannot be the addition of new issue areas to the foreign policy portfolio. It requires a whole new look at what foreign policy and international relations are and can be. Because all of these issues can no longer be understood solely on the level of the international. They reach deep into the core of everyday life. They highlight the complex web of societal power relations that underlie and structure eminent global concerns. This, again, requires a broad understanding of security that surpasses traditional concerns over national or even international and global security. Because these frameworks, let's face it, are often not best placed to work through a global health crisis that depends so much on the interaction between every individual citizen, state policy, and the politics of international actors, where welfare and healthcare systems, civil society engagement have moved so quickly up the ladder of security priorities. So what we need is a broadening of our scholarly and practical scope to include societal inequalities and insecurity that shape these global pressing concerns. And feminism is well equipped to offer such approaches that take the link between the different levels of analysis seriously and that offer this broader conceptualization of security, because this is how feminists have seen and studied the world for a very long time. So feminism, if you will, is an early warning system for any non-traditional security concern and global emergency. And one axis of power that feminists are, of course, interested in is gender equality or inequality and women's in and exclusion. The pandemic has exacerbated gender inequalities and insecurities worldwide. This concerns, importantly, gendered labor divisions, where women were disproportionately affected by job losses in the formal and informal economy. It's also seen in the massive reallocation of care responsibilities onto women. Every woman in the room knows this, and also additionally the rise of gender-based violence. Now, 2020 should have been the year where we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, the beginning of the WPS agenda that I mentioned earlier. Instead, the pandemic has set the agenda back in many ways. In post-conflict and conflict settings in particular, the pandemic has enhanced gendered vulnerabilities and led to further exclusion of women from conflict resolution, but also from COVID resolution. In conflict areas, crisis dynamics further weakened infrastructures and institutions and exacerbated the multiple structures of violence that women face on the domestic level, within communities, and from armed groups. At the same time, misogynist regimes and extremist groups have used the pandemic to restrict women's mobility further. We have already seen this in the case of the Ebola virus, where women were at risk of violence and sexual abuse from security forces, but also from healthcare workers. So overall, the pandemic is curtailing the ability to organize and seek support for women. It hampers their resilience, if you will, and to participate in peace negotiations and post-conflict reconstruction. And the research is very clear on this. Women should not only be at the table so that their concerns and security interests are considered. Women at the table also enhance the chances for peace agreements to last and for societal consolidation after conflict to yield productive results. And this is just one way in which the everyday insecurities of women are connected to the way armed conflict is overcome or not. This, however, is not only the problem of faraway conflict zones, considering the case of Sarah Everand in the UK, a young woman who was arrested by a policeman under the false pretense that she was violating COVID restrictions. He then brutally assaulted and murdered her. Policemen then further attacked the women who gathered in protest of this incident on the basis of COVID restriction. So in the Western world as well, we're seeing COVID entangled with structures of violence that affect women's safety, public presence, and representation. Now, the pandemic has had all of these gendered effects, particularly in the realm of security and international politics, and in the areas that are targeted by the WPS agenda. But at the same time, a gender perspective and WPS offer manifold frameworks and strategies for thinking through this security challenge as non-traditional. So what we should be doing is to push for a wide definition of WPS so that the issue of global health security is seen as a women, peace, and security issue that needs a gender-sensitive approach and associated measures of protection, inclusion, participation, and representation. Now, what are these approaches and tools that we might take from WPS in our answers to the pandemic? First of all, WPS says we need a gender analysis of any crisis for us to be able to come up with efficient and inclusive solutions. So we need to mobilize national action plans. We need to mobilize the EU action plan on WPS for building knowledge and capacity for these issues in our foreign policy institutions, so that in this and any future global emergency, these institutions are up for the job of understanding the gendered implications as well as the underlying inequalities of non-traditional security concerns. Second, WPS says we need participation of women and also gender non-conforming subjects. We need to make sure that women's concerns, needs, and experience are included in any measures addressing the pandemic, that resources and infrastructures are not moved away from them in the wake of the pandemic, especially around sexual and reproductive health and rights. Again, the Ebola virus has shown us that resources in this area are very easily and quickly reallocated to emergency measures with dire consequences for women. Obviously, we have to ensure that women have full access to health care, that local authorities do not use COVID-related restrictions on mobility and other rights to further curtail women's freedom. I'm drawing quite heavily for a minute now on what Julia Smith and her colleagues have suggested in the Canadian Journal of Foreign Policy, where they argue we need to push for a feminist global health agenda. This is something the feminists have called for a long time, that we need to integrate gender concerns into global health governance and institutionalize these concerns more thoroughly within the World Health Organization. They also suggest that in our international assistance activities, we should focus much more on the care economy, because focusing on economic empowerment and political participation of women only has proven to be extremely vulnerable to shocks within the care economy, like we have seen them with the pandemic. They also suggest that we advocate for a gender perspective in the security sector, in this case in particular, because we're drawing on military and security forces quite heavily in managing the pandemic. And these are the areas that are often ill-equipped to protect and sometimes even threatening the rights of women and other marginalized populations. So we should get our security forces up to the job of responding to everyday insecurities. We should strengthen their understanding of and response to gender-specific violations during health crisis. And thirdly, WPS reminds us that we also need to and always need to include the local civil society, especially women's networks and NGOs, because they have the knowledge and the networks that state and international actors often do not. It was very often grassroots women's networks in conflict-affected areas in Yemen, Pakistan, or Iraq, who were originally established to promote peace processes and gender equality, which then became very quickly actors at the forefront in the fight against the pandemic. So a priority of foreign policy should be to support and protect these actors as multipliers of gender inclusiveness, peace, and pandemic relief. Now, you are all the experts in the exciting issues that will be debated over the next few days. And it is your insights and ideas that will move these areas forward. What I would like to do in conclusion maybe is to offer a few provocations, if you will, from a feminist perspective to the framing of this conference as focused on the post-pandemic, multi-level, and resilience-based. 3 interventions that might on how we might take feminist scholarship on foreign policy and international relations to move toward a post-pandemic vision for global policy. And the first provocation is that there can be no post, as in post-pandemic, not now and not ever. This is one of the main challenges that feminists have offered to peace and conflict studies, that the distinction between conflict and post-conflict is misleading at best. First, because it does not map neatly onto women's experiences of insecurity and marginalization before, during, or after conflict. That is much more often structured by a continuum of violence at multiple levels, from domestic, structural, to state violence, intersecting across different phases of the conflict. And second, because the social power dynamics and structures of inequality that have led a society into conflict are often not the ones that women wish to return to in the post-conflict moment. So for pandemic politics, this means that we need to address the societal inequalities and global insecurities that have structured the pre-pandemic moment now, because it is them, rather than the pandemic itself, that are fostering the unequal distribution of resources that the Deputy Minister mentioned earlier in fighting the pandemic and weaken the social fabric of resilient societies. The second provocation, and I have talked about this quite a bit already, is that there are no separate levels of analysis. While we may analytically separate international, state, and individual levels, we should think much more about how these levels are connected. Think about my earlier examples of how gendered care economies determine post-conflict reconstruction, or how domestic violence can be an effect of large-scale society efforts to fight the pandemic and at the same time undermine the purpose of these efforts. And thirdly, more tailored to the theme of this conference, feminists tell us that resilience is not something that can be built, and not, in particularly not simply from the outside. And resilience as a concept and governance tool, Andre has mentioned this already, has seen a bit of a comeback, including a focus on women as bearers of resilience and often as a target of associated measures. But feminists remind us that there is a danger in this concept towards reifying the status quo, because it very often assumes that some crises are just inevitable and not doing a thorough enough analysis of the social structures and inequalities that are underpinning any crisis, be it economic collapse, natural disaster, or a pandemic. This leads us sometimes to rely on instrumentalist and stereotypical representations of women's assumed skills and abilities in the name of effectiveness. It can obscure the patriarchal structures that are actually at the core of many of these crises. And in addition, it puts undue burden onto women to alleviate societal suffering. So this is not a plea to abandon resilience as a concept. It is a plea to include feminist, post-colonial, decolonial approaches that highlight resilience as a process, as something that is already inherent in community strategies for survival and support, but that it needs to be a radical concept, one that centers on emancipation, community, and solidarity. I'm thinking here of the work of Ana Juncos, Philippe Bourbon, Maria Martín de Almagro, and Paul Bargués-Pedreni, just a few who have worked intensely on these issues. A final caveat in this regard is also that the feminist agenda in foreign policy often puts a lot of emphasis on local knowledges and networks, and I think the resilience frame is one that does this quite strongly. And I think we need to beware of the fetishization of a bottom-up and civil society approach. There needs to be a top-down as well, and this entails committed, powerful actors that will stand by the actors on the ground that are implementing these policies. So, in conclusion, and following these calls to think critically about the notion of the post, the notion of separate levels of analysis, and a plea to see resilience as a politicized concept, I hope that you will all be, at least to some extent, feminists in thinking post-pandemic futures in foreign policy, even if your area of expertise does not entail a focus on gender or women at all. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Saskia Stachowitsch for such thought-provoking, actually, presentation. I didn't know where everywhere she'll take this topic, and she took it by a spin completely everywhere. So we have about 10 minutes. If you need your coffee break, please help yourself, but we started later, so I'm going to take some time for discussion. If we have any questions in the audience online, we might want to redirect to your email address later on. But there are a few things that I picked up on, and I could have a long conversation with you, but I'll dive directly into two areas, especially groups that are vulnerable, because I have recently attended at one embassy event on women's rights, and one of the feedbacks we got from root society sort of groups was that we are elitists and we tend to have these big visions, and we are not connected to the vulnerable groups, to the women that are in crisis. And somebody pointed out from the Czech Civil Service, well, you know, it's a pre-election and middle class in Czech Republic is not interested in these people because they're not the voters, really. Another group that was there was exactly the Women's Network, the lobbyist group that's trying to help with these topics in Parliament. But the budget in Czech Republic is 2 million crowns a year, which I converted quickly, 79,000 euros. All that they get for this kind of, for American audience, 91,000 American dollars. So that's all they get. So the question, you know, and I always say, and that's the second question I have also are the refugees, because we have so many centers now that are struggling to keep it safe, even for health reasons. We talk about pandemic. So somebody said, well, another issue here is middle class cannot really relate to these groups because it wouldn't happen to them. But if you notice, some people leaving Syria, Afghanistan are middle class people who had to flee with a plastic bag and a t-shirt, have no projections for their children's future. And we frown upon them to come here sometimes in very dear conditions, but they are not all low-income people. And I guess the third point that you made was very striking, is that post-pandemic and discussion about the ongoing issues, that it's something that doesn't end or we can't kind of distinguish. In our research, we usually say the issues that we have today predate pandemic. So it's similar concept. So because they started before, they were just exacerbated, as you said. So we are looking at the past and future as a sort of path. There is a path that hit a very major roadblock. So if you can please comment, maybe from your context in Austria, how do you overcome these issues with budget and really including the civil society that you mentioned, these vulnerable groups? And how do you convince the middle class and decision makers that these are also voters or potential voters if they integrate and become citizens, that you are working with the future voters and families?
Thank you, Alica. These are all really good questions that cut to the heart of many of the problems that we're having with the agenda and the implementation of it. One is certainly a bigger issue within feminism, that is, who are women, right? And women increasingly, we're becoming aware, are not a coherent social group, but there's other intersecting relations. You mentioned class, racial and ethnicity, sexuality. So there's many aspects to what women are, and it's it's too much to ask that they would be lobbying for the same thing. So I think to a certain extent we have to allow for these differences. We cannot say feminism or the WPS agenda is about one thing and we stick to it. It will evolve, and it will always have these struggles. And there is a more conservative way of thinking about it in terms of women's inclusion and exclusion. But there's also more radical ways in terms of sexuality, intersectional approaches, and a move away actually from a women-only focused perspective, one that, for example, discusses the issue of violence against men, sexual violence and conflict against men, that talks much more about how can we include boys and men into any effort to overcome these problems. So these are some of the fault lines within feminism. I don't have an answer to how to solve them. I think to a certain extent we have to allow them and see that feminism is a broad project that will continue to have these struggles. How do we get to the truly vulnerable? That's an issue, certainly. And this is why the social the approach to include civil society is so important because they are the experts. They're not just the targets of any of these foreign policy measures. They're the experts on their own vulnerability and their own situation. So I think something that institutions, foreign policy institutions can do is to have a professional, structured consultation process that draws on these groups and allows for a conversation in a more structured way. So that's one thing, and that actually does not cost a lot of money. So if we're thinking about resources, that is a good way to have resources that are scarce, and I know this from the Austrian context, extremely scarce for these issues, in how you can use them effectively. Another way is, well, my priority would always be put resources into your own institutions first, before you go anywhere else and interact with local contexts that you might not understand. It's always best, I think, to start with foreign policy institutions and other ministries right here and think about how can we build the knowledge, how can we build the capacity, how can we have structures that ensure that these kinds of topics are not just fashionable at one point and then disappear again. So institutional continuity matters a great deal. In terms of the issue of refugees and migration, there's actually quite some debate in the WPS community on whether and how to include issues of migration into women, peace, and security agenda. And there's some voices that say this is absolutely not what we want, because we have fought so hard, and this is a struggle, we have fought so hard against patriarchal resistance to these topics. Now finally there's a little bit of leeway within foreign policy circles, within more conservative elites, that a women's focus in peace negotiations and international assistance is relevant. We absolutely do not want to include another issue area, especially one that is so contested. But I would encourage anyone who is working on these issues within these institutions to be brave and to keep pushing for it, because WPS needs to be brought to really make sense of the manifold ways in which gender comes into international relations and foreign policy. I understand why policymakers are timid to do this, because they want to guard what they have achieved. I see the struggle, but I think it should be a forward way to include even more topics. And migration certainly is one where gendered violence in the countries of origin, in transit, in the countries of destination is extremely relevant, and where we can see that faraway conflict is actually traveling with people and affecting them. So if we have a very broad understanding of what conflict is, certainly we need to include migration. Remind me of anything else that I might have forgotten.
I just made remark about the pre-COVID. Is there anybody in the audience, because I shouldn't take over? Yes, please. And can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. My name is Paspon Sengasubana. I'm the Thai ambassador here in Czech Republic, and definitely the WPS is really close to my heart. And I just want to share that in Southeast Asia, especially in the ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, we are having this WPS agenda close to our hearts, and we're trying to advocate it in a more of a whole society approach. We think that it is very important that we could have the engagement of all the stakeholders, whether you are NGOs or local communities, to be part of this WPS agenda. So I just want to share that in Southeast Asia we are doing that. But I need your perspective perhaps. Could women, especially women diplomats, could we become like agent of change, perhaps on sustainable development? Because we are talking about post-pandemics, and whereby women have been very affected by the pandemic challenges. You have rightly said on the violence in homes, and on employment. We are being unemployed in society. Could diplomat like us who are female, could we have become the agent of change with sustainable development? Because His Excellency Deputy Foreign Minister has indicated on the humanitarian assistance to developing countries. Could that be part of the foreign policy element? I just want to ask for your perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this question. I cannot fully answer it, I'm afraid. I can only say that you are already, agents of change for sure. Certainly through the Foreign Service and diplomats, this is the way of how, foreign ministries can form these local relationships, and I think it's very important. But in my experience, it depends greatly on the resources and kind of infrastructure that is behind you all in your home countries. So I appreciate the sentiment, but I would also warn that it is not on women diplomats only to implement the agenda. I mean, traditionally we know this, we have to be at the forefront, but actually I think it needs a commitment from the Foreign Ministry, from the Foreign Service, to then have like a structure of embassies, of diplomats that can then implement this on the local level. This is also one of the ways in which capacity can be built, not only thinking about this house, for example, but thinking about the Foreign Service and how it relates to local communities, but also, again, how to bring local communities to the center of policy making. So this is what I'm imagining when I'm thinking about a structured consultation process.
I don't see hands up, so I'm going to ask last question because we have a second panel coming up soon. But this is a question for also younger generation that is so attached to social media. And as we know, we had such a issue yesterday with the global outage with some social media for hours. Everybody was really miserable. But through that, we saw a lot of cross-sharing of situation in Afghanistan. And the issue for me is, how do you think we can sort of maintain some momentum? Because we all saw some images, Taliban taking over in a blitzkrieg, quite horrific. And then the situation of women drastically shifting in some cases, going from changes that they acquired to a different path. And so we all were really sad and upset, but you don't see that in the media anymore, as if it did not exist. So this is my concern. How do we maintain this kind of topics because the change happens if we keep talking about it and doing something about it and share and debate. But I use this one example, but there's many. And we only focused in a global world on this one, but there's others. And second one is, we all talk about how to include boys, and there is violence against boys and men, which is very traumatic, and also non-binary people and so forth. How do we include that kind of media coverage and discussions? Because some are really not ready to have these conversations. They say we haven't resolved one, and we already are talking about non-binary people and so forth. So how do we start having those conversations if they are part of solution? Thank you.
Alica, you have a way of bringing up the big questions and then asking me to do it quickly. Well, in the case of Afghanistan, I'm afraid I cannot offer a very optimistic perspective. I mean, we're already seeing the international community less interested in the issue around gender equality, which they claimed for such a long time was the reason why Afghanistan mattered to them. We're now seeing that this is clearly not the case. We can sustain momentum We can keep talking about it, and we certainly will, but I think right now we should still be thinking about how to get as many as possible who are at risk in Afghanistan out and how to build new lives for them. I'm seeing a great initiative at Monash University in Australia where they have been working on WPS issues with women in Afghanistan, local networks, and they're doing a great job at really, you know, getting them to safety, which I think is a priority right now. We can keep talking about it, and we should be talking about it, but we should always make it about ourselves as well. So if we're talking about gender issues as if they only mattered over there, then we're not doing a service to them. So whenever we bring up sexism and gender inequality in our own Western institution, we're doing the whole feminist endeavor a favor, I think. So a way to keep talking about these issues is also to make clear that all of these things are connected and that we are not exempt from a gender analysis. How to bring in issues around men and boys, non-binary people. We just have to do it. We just have to do it. It's people are not ready, but people were also not ready to have the WPS discussion 20 years ago, and look how far we've come. So I think always arguing that even if women are priority population for some of these measures, WPS is always about a broader societal change that always includes men and includes a critical perspective on masculinities and how they might be contributing to conflict dynamics. So insisting on a broad definition always, even if it makes it harder to sell the agenda in some circles.
Thank you so much, and I want to give you applause. Such a good discussion today.